I kicked open that kitchen door, expecting to find the man who had taken a little girl from her family. But instead, I found a woman in a worn brown coat standing over the ransom note, holding it like she already knew something I didn't. And the worst part was, she was right. My name is Daniel Mercer, and for 17 years I was the kind of detective who believed patience, experience, and evidence could solve anything. I had built my entire career around trusting the facts in front of me, but that morning, those same facts were about to lead me straight into the biggest mistake of my life. The case was supposed to be simple. A 9-year-old girl named Emma Caldwell had vanished from her bedroom in the middle of the night in the quiet town of Fairmont Ridge, a place where people still waved at neighbors and left their doors unlocked during the day. But all of that changed the moment Emma disappeared. Her mother, Rachel, sat on the edge of her living room couch clutching a small purple stuffed rabbit that still carried the faint smell of her daughter's shampoo. She hadn't slept. She hadn't eaten. She just stared at the front door, like somehow Emma would walk back through it and apologize for scaring everyone. The clock on the wall read 5:47 in the morning when I arrived, and I remember thinking that time felt wrong. Everything about that house felt frozen. The coffee on the counter was untouched. A cartoon was paused on the television. A pair of tiny sneakers sat by the stairs, waiting for a child who wasn't coming home. We had been searching for 14 hours. We had fingerprints. We had partial DNA. We had a handwritten ransom note demanding money and threatening consequences if the family went to the police. And we had a suspect. His name was Aaron Voss, a local mechanic with a history of angry outbursts and a reputation that made people uncomfortable. Every piece of information seemed to point in one direction. To me, it looked like the answer was already sitting on the table. Then she walked in. Nobody knew who she was at first. She wasn't wearing a badge. She wasn't wearing a police jacket. She didn't announce herself or demand attention. She simply stepped into the kitchen, looked around, and picked up the ransom note. She was a black woman, probably in her late 50s, with tired eyes and a calm expression that somehow made me more irritated than if she had walked in shouting. She wore an old wool coat that looked like it had survived more winters than most people I knew. I watched her read the note once, then twice. Then she quietly said, "The person who wrote this isn't Aaron Voss." I remember almost laughing, not because it was funny, but because I couldn't believe someone had walked into my crime scene and said that after looking at one piece of paper for less than a minute. "Excuse me," I said. She pointed at one word in the letter. "A simple spelling mistake. This pattern doesn't match him," she said. "The writer is trying to imitate someone else's ability level." My partner Kyle Bennett leaned against the counter and smirked. "Ma'am, bam. The library is 2 blocks away if you want to correct grammar mistakes. This is a police investigation." She looked at him, then looked back at me. She wasn't angry. That almost bothered me more. She had the look of someone watching a person make a mistake, but knowing they weren't ready to hear the truth. "Detective, you need to look deeper into the writing," she said. "The language tells you who wrote it." I slammed my hand down on the counter. "This is evidence, not a classroom. You don't get to walk in here and start rewriting my investigation." Her face changed slightly, just for a second. Not anger, disappointment, like I had confirmed something she already suspected about people like me. "Show me your credentials," I demanded. She reached into her bag and touched a worn leather folder. But before she could open it, I stopped her. "No, you're done here." My partner stepped forward and escorted her toward the door. She didn't fight. She didn't raise her voice. She just picked up her folder and walked outside into the cold rain. Through the window, I watched her sit on the front steps, open that old letter folder, and start writing with a red pen. 3 pages, no phone calls, no complaints, just 3 pages of notes while rain soaked her coat and her hands shook from the cold. At the time, I thought she was trying to prove a point. I thought she was someone who couldn't accept being ignored. I had no idea that those 3 pages were about to expose the truth, destroy my confidence, and force me to question every decision I had made that night. Because 2 hours later, we would break down the wrong door, arrest the wrong man, and put an innocent person in handcuffs while the real person responsible for Emma's disappearance was still watching from the shadows. The sound of that front door breaking still follows me sometimes. People think moments like that feel powerful. Like in the movies where the police rush in, everyone freezes, and the hero finally catches the person they've been chasing. The truth is, real life doesn't work that way. Sometimes the loudest moments are the ones you wish you could take back. We had spent hours building the case against Aaron Voss, and by sunrise, Everyone on my team believed we were about to bring Emma Caldwell home. The evidence looked solid. The timeline made sense. The suspect had the kind of background people wanted to believe belonged to someone capable of hurting a child. And when you are tired, scared, and desperate to find answers, sometimes your brain starts filling in the blanks before the truth has a chance to speak. We arrived at the Voss property just after 8 in the morning. The neighbors watched from their porches as police vehicles surrounded the house. Reporters were already gathering because a missing child case in a small town doesn't stay private for long. Everyone wanted the name. Everyone wanted someone to blame. And honestly, a part of me wanted that too. I wanted the case finished. I wanted to call Rachel Caldwell and tell her we had found the person responsible. I wanted to believe that all the hours, all the sleepless nights, and all the pressure had finally led us to the right place. We entered the house fast, too fast. Within minutes, we found someone inside, but it wasn't Aaron. It was his older twin brother, Marcus Voss. Marcus was 40 years old, a quiet man who worked part-time at a local recycling center. He had a learning disability that affected the way he processed information, and he'd always depended on his brother and mother for support. He wasn't dangerous. He wasn't aggressive. He wasn't even angry when we put him in handcuffs. He just looked confused. "I don't understand," he kept saying. "Why are you doing this? I didn't take anybody." I remember those words because they didn't sound like the words of someone trying to escape. They sounded like the words of someone whose entire world had just collapsed. Outside, his mother came running down the driveway. She was an older woman named Evelyn Voss, and when she saw her son being taken away, something in her broke. She grabbed the arm of the officer beside her and screamed Marcus's name over and over. It wasn't a dramatic movie scream. It was the sound of a mother watching the world accuse her child of something she knew he couldn't have done. A reporter caught the entire thing on camera. By that afternoon, the footage was everywhere. People online were already calling Marcus guilty. They didn't know him. They didn't know the evidence. They didn't know the truth. But they had a picture. And sometimes a picture is all people need before they decide who deserves their anger. I sat in my office watching the news clip on a small television in the corner, and for the first time that day, I felt something I hated feeling: doubt. Then my captain called me upstairs. His face told me something was wrong before he even spoke. Captain Harold Whitmore closed the door behind me and placed a printed email on the desk. "Did you read the FBI notification from last night?" he asked. I looked at the paper. The email had been sent at 4:02 a.m. My name was listed as the lead investigator. I felt my stomach drop. "No," I said quietly. He didn't yell. "That was worse. You didn't read it because you were already convinced you had your guy." The room suddenly felt smaller. The woman in the kitchen. The woman in the rain. The one I told to leave. She wasn't some random person. Her name was Dr. Naomi Ellis, a forensic linguistic specialist who had worked with federal investigators for over a decade. She studied the patterns hidden inside written language, the things most people ignored, the tiny choices people made without realizing it. Captain Whitmore placed 3 pages on my desk, the same 3 pages Naomi had written outside my crime scene. The red ink was still visible in places where the rain had blurred the writing. "She analyzed the ransom note in 4 minutes, he said. "You dismissed her in 4 seconds. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Because the more I read, the worse it got. Naomi had identified that the mistakes in the letter were not random. Someone had intentionally created them to make investigators believe the writer had limited education. But the person who actually wrote the note understood language far better than they wanted anyone to know. The mistakes were an act, a disguise, and the person being framed was Marcus Voss, the man we had just arrested. Naomi's analysis pointed towards someone else entirely, someone much closer to Emma. Gregory Caldwell, Emma's uncle, a respected man in the community, the kind of person everyone trusted because he always smiled, always volunteered at town events, and always knew exactly what to say. That behind that image was a serious problem. Gregory had accumulated nearly $80,000 in gambling debt. He had borrowed money from people who were no longer asking politely for repayment. Naomi believed Gregory had used Marcus because he knew Marcus was vulnerable, someone who could be manipulated, someone the town would believe was capable of something terrible because of assumptions people were already willing to make. I grabbed my jacket and ran back downstairs. I needed to find Naomi. I needed to apologize. I needed to tell her she was right. But when I reached the place outside the Caldwell house where she had been sitting in the rain, she was gone. The only thing left behind was her old leather folder sitting on the chair. Inside was not a report about me, not an angry complaint, not a demand for an apology. It was something I never expected, a photograph of a little boy with a missing front tooth, smiling at the camera like the world was still a safe place. On the back of the picture, Naomi had written one sentence, "For the ones they don't believe." Underneath that photo was a stack of case files, dozens of them, children who had been accused, misunderstood, and judged because people didn't take the time to understand the way they communicated. Some cases involved teenagers. Some involved families who couldn't afford lawyers. Some involved kids whose voices were ignored because they didn't sound the way people expected them to sound. And suddenly, I understood something I should have understood from the beginning. Naomi wasn't just analyzing a ransom note. She was fighting a battle she had been fighting for years. She knew what happened when people decided they already knew the truth before listening. The red ink on her fingers wasn't from some academic exercise. It came from years of writing explanations for people who had no one else willing to defend them. And one of those cases, I would later learn, involved a 16-year-old boy in Mississippi whose entire future had nearly been destroyed because someone misunderstood the way he wrote. That night, we followed Naomi's analysis. We searched the places Gregory Caldwell had access to. We tracked financial records. We rebuilt the timeline. And then, just before midnight, we found something hidden inside an old storage facility outside town, something that made every person in that room stop breathing for a second. Emma was there, alive, scared, but alive, and standing there in that moment, hearing her mother cry when she saw her daughter again. I realized the person who saved Emma wasn't the detective who had chased the obvious answer. It wasn't the man with the badge who thought he knew everything. It was the woman I had pushed out into the rain because I was too proud to listen, and I knew that before the night was over, I had one more thing to do. I had to face the cameras, face the town, and admit that the biggest mistake in the investigation wasn't missing a clue. It was believing I was the only person in the room who could see it. The next morning, I stood in front of a wall of cameras, microphones, and flashing lights. But for the first time in 17 years wearing that badge, I wasn't standing there feeling proud. I wasn't there to announce a victory. I wasn't there to tell people how my team had solved a difficult case. I was there because the truth had a way of finding the one person in the room who needed to hear it the most. And that person was me. I looked at the crowd of reporters gathered outside the Fairmont Ridge Police Department, and I knew exactly what I had to say. I couldn't hide behind procedure. I couldn't blame the pressure. I couldn't say everyone made mistakes, because at the center of everything was one simple fact. A woman walked into my investigation, saw what I couldn't see, tried to warn me, and I told her to leave. I took a breath and said her name, Dr. Naomi Ellis. For a moment, the entire room became quiet. I explained who she was, what she had discovered, and how her analysis of the ransom note led us to Emma Caldwell's real kidnapper. I admitted that she had tried to help us before we made the mistake of arresting Marcus Voss. I admitted that my own confidence became the biggest obstacle standing between us and the truth. There were no excuses. There was only accountability. After the press conference, I went to the Voss family's home. I had rehearsed what I wanted to say on the drive there, but the moment Evelyn Voss opened the door, every carefully prepared sentence disappeared. How do you apologize to a mother who watched her son get taken away for something he didn't do? How do you explain that the system designed to protect people almost destroyed someone because people like me were too quick to believe the easiest answer? Marcus was sitting at the kitchen table when I walked in. He looked smaller than I remembered, not because he had changed, but because I finally saw him as a person instead of a suspect. I told him I was sorry. Not the kind of apology people give when they want the conversation to end. A real apology. The kind where you admit you caused damage even if you never intended to. Marcus was quiet for a long time. Then he looked at me and said something I will never forget. I knew somebody would listen eventually. That was it. No anger, no shouting, no demand for revenge. Just relief. And somehow, that made it harder. Because Marcus had every reason to hate me. But instead he reminded me of something I had forgotten. Behind every file number, every piece of evidence, every investigation, there is a person hoping someone will see them clearly. A few days later, I finally found Naomi. She was working out of a small office above an old community center on the other side of town. There were no fancy decorations, no awards covering the walls, no signs telling people how important she was. Just shelves filled with case files, handwritten notes, and photographs of families who had needed someone to fight for them. When she saw me standing in the doorway, she wasn't surprised. She simply smiled slightly and said, "I wondered how long it would take you to come by." I didn't know whether that was forgiveness or just an observation. Maybe both. I handed her the $15,000 reward money from the Emma Caldwell case. She looked at the check and pushed it back toward me. "There are people who need this more than I do," she said. That was Naomi. Even after everything, she wasn't thinking about herself. She wanted the money to go toward children and families who didn't have resources, people who had been judged before anyone bothered to understand them. So I donated the entire amount to her legal support fund, the same fund that helped kids whose voices had been ignored, whose words had been misunderstood, and whose futures depended on someone taking a second look. Before I left, I asked her a question that had been bothering me since that morning in the kitchen. "Why didn't you get angry?" I asked. "You had every reason to walk away and let me fail." She looked down at the old folder in her hands, the same folder she carried that day in the rain. Then she said, "Because the person who refuses to listen today might be the person who learns to listen tomorrow." I don't know if she realized it at the time, but those words stayed with me longer than any training, any award, or any lesson I learned in law enforcement. A few months later, I stepped away from Investigation Division. Some people thought I quit because of the embarrassment. They were wrong. I left because I finally understood what kind of detective I wanted to become, not the one who always had the fastest answer, not the one who walked into a room believing he was automatically the smartest person there. I wanted to become the kind of person who could recognize wisdom even when it came from someone I didn't expect. Looking back now, the most painful part of that case wasn't that I missed the clue. Everyone misses clues. The painful part was that I almost ignored the person holding it. I think about Naomi sitting outside in the cold rain, writing those 3 pages while I stood inside believing I had everything figured out. She could have walked away. She could have let my mistake become my problem. But she didn't. She cared more about saving Emma than proving me wrong. And maybe that's the greatest lesson I took from all of this. Sometimes the smartest person in the room isn't the person with the most authority. Sometimes it isn't the person speaking the loudest. Sometimes it's the person everyone else overlooks. The person sitting quietly. The person asking you to slow down and look again. The person you might dismiss because they don't look like the expert you expected to find. So now I want to ask you something. If you were Naomi, standing in that kitchen after being treated like you didn't belong, would you have stayed and helped? Would you have forgiven someone like me after being ignored when a child's life was at stake? Or do you believe some mistakes are too serious to forgive? Tell me what you think in the comments. Because this story isn't only about a missing child or a criminal investigation. It's about pride, judgment, and the dangerous moment when we stop listening because we believe we already know the truth. Share this story with someone who believes every person deserves to be heard before they are judged. Because sometimes the person who changes everything isn't the one holding the badge, the title, or the power. Sometimes it's the person standing quietly in the corner, waiting for someone to finally open their eyes.